with okay, so we can start with our first session of the season. I'm very glad to introduce Anne Lepoittevin. I'm gonna give a short presentation of her. Anne holds an agrégation in Histoire, and she was a former resident of the Foundation Thiers. She has been lectured in early modern art history at the University of Sorbonne, and she's currently maître de conférence in early modern art history at the Sorbonne Université, Centre André Chastel. Her research examines Italian sacred art before and after the Council of Trent, Sacri Monti, devotional statuary, votive lay figures, Agnus Dei, as well as early modern Italian artistic literature, Ghiberti and Alberti, Tridentine treatises on images. She's also interested in the sociology of art. And I would like to mention two works. She's young, yet a prominent scholar. And I would like to mention two works that I had the opportunity to read. The first one is an article. Let me say, if I can pronounce well, Piccolini et Piccioli, La Fabrique Romaine des Agnus Dei. And the second one, it's a collective book that she worked with Emmanuel Lorrain, Alain Méron, Florence Ville d'Art and Le Français, La création d'un mythe. And this book, I would like to say a few words of it. It's a book that analyzes the role of the French in the construction of a myth of Florence as a city of art through history, literature, and various forms of artistic production. I didn't finish up yet, but I really enjoyed the book, and I just want to say it. So it's a great piece of work. But today's talk, what the Agnus Dei owed to the Jesuits, deals with one of Anne's favorite subjects, the Agnus Dei, which, as you know, are papal sacramentals made in Rome since the Middle Ages. So during the Counter-Reformation, their production was reorganized, as we know, and tightly controlled by the Vatican. So I guess we are going to hear a lot about how the Jesuits were involved in that. So, Anne, it's a great pleasure to have you here, and the floor is yours. Please, what do you want? Thanks a lot.
So, can you see my screen? Yes? Good. Thank you, Chastel. I'm still young. And I really wanted to thank you for giving me the floor today, because this subject has been on my mind for the last 7 years. And I do also apologize for my English, rusty English. So I'm an historian, as it was said, of religious Italian art, and I'm partially going to talk about missions in South America. I'm not a specialist of Jesuits, and I'm going to talk about Jesuits. So it is now clear, I hope, that I am stepping into territory that is not my own, and I obviously be very curious to hear your feedback. My presentation, my presentation will be in two parts. Firstly, I will go back over the conclusions of research, mainly mine, published and unpublished, on the Agnus Dei to present the object, still little known or misunderstood, even though we can find it worldwide in archives, missionary letters, sacristies, and dusty attics. I will then examine the role of importance of the Jesuits for the Agnus Dei, as my title says, and of the Agnus Dei for the Jesuits. As a clarification, I'm not going to talk only about the globalization of objects or attempt a quantitative mapping of Agnus Dei circulations and functions through the Jesuit missions. It is quite impossible, at this stage, just as it was impossible to map Roman relics 10 years ago. Rather,
Excusez-moi, we cannot see the entire screen.
Oui, et bonjour Anne. Excusez-moi, peut-être tu peux agrandir un peu l'image, tu vois, parce qu'on ne voit pas grande l'image du PowerPoint. On le voit trop petite, trop petit. Voilà.
Thank you. Rather, I want to offer a broader overview of the very specific role played by the Jesuits in the history of those small Roman and more than Roman pontifical sacramentals blessed by the Pope during Easter celebrations, here Clement XI, and credited with an almost infinite number of miraculous properties. So, the Agnus Dei. The Agnus Dei was one of the Catholic devotional objects that proliferated in the 16th century, along with rosary beds, small portable altars, engraving, statuettes, copies of miraculous images, and so on. More specifically, it was one of the Roman objects that floated the newly globalized world in the missionaries' suitcases, along with others Roman objects, such as Roman relics, copies of the Veronica, and Roman devotional medals. Of course, that existed since at least the 9th century, but it was at that time, I must say, an extremely rare object, distributed by the drop to the Pope's Mensa and to the most important crowned heads. Several late authors trace international Agnus Dei circulations back to Leo III, who is said to have given a gold ring Agnus Dei to Charlemagne. This was the case of Sebastiani in 1683. Those authors would eventually go back to the Roman first Christians, as they always present the Agnus Dei as a Christian antiquity in the context of new Christian archaeology. Avignon marked a very important turning point in the history of Agnus Dei. From that date onwards, they became more directly associated with the Pope, the reigning Pope, who blessed them and whose name and coat of arms they bore. It was in Avignon that the waxes were first inscribed with the name of the reigning Pope, so that the identity and authority of the Pope who blessed them could not be disputed. This innovation was then definitive. You can see the waxes of Bonifacius IX and Gregory XII, bearing the name of the reigning Pope written in large type in the image filled just under the standing Agnus. They are therefore long been crucial objects in the symbolic war of pontifical legitimacy, and over time would become markers of obedience to Rome. As such, they were the subject of the treatise on idolatry. Excuse me, I can't change the slide. Back. I said it was the subject of can't find my point. Yes, a subject of a treatise on idolatry by the graphomaniac Luther in 1539, who named them wax gods. The Tridentine period marks a radical turning point in the history of such objects, as in the history of all devotional objects, as we know, now globalized. It is therefore quite logical to observe that the papacy entrusted their fabrication to monks, the Feuillants, thus creating the most formidable and lasting factories on sacred art known. The Apostolic Chamber also began, 1, to control production, iconography, forms, dimensions, ornamentation, packaging, containers, distribution of sheets printed in multiple languages, specifying the effects of the Agnus Dei. 2, to take a hard line against the production, many production of forgeries. 3, to control distribution as well, places and methods, economic practices for the objects. And 4 as well, and it is the most difficult, they tried hard also. They tried to control the religious and private manipulations of the waxes and their functions. It is at this point of their history that the Agnus Dei takes on its almost definitive aspect. I will now present with Equan, with this wax from Equan. The small size wax medallions show on their obverse side the hallowed Paschal lamb lying on the book of the Apocalypse with its 7 seals, bearing a lance-shaped cross with the pennant of the resurrection. A more or less abbreviated inscription figures around the lamb, recalling the words of John the Baptist. Ecce Agnus Dei, etc. Vitolit pecada mundi. While the Pope's coat of arms, and sometimes his name and the year of his pontificate are recorded beneath the book. Here you can see the coat of arms of Pius V. The iconography of the reverse side of these wax objects varies with time. Until the end of the 16th century, it used to bear sacrificial iconography in accordance with symbolism of the Lamb of God. So at Equan, you can see an Imago Pietatis made out of a mold around 1500, clearly under Tuscan stylistic influence. Through the 17th century, the reverse becomes increasingly inspired by the reality of Rome, the miraculous virgins, the devotions due to the Pope, the many effigies of new saints, renewed Roman Paleo-Christian monuments. You can see on the screen the Constantine baptistry, confronted to a pontifical medal issued the same year by the same goldsmith. Still on the reverse, a Latin inscription bore the name of the Pope and the year of the pontificate, when these were not mentioned on the obverse. On the Equan wax, you can see Pius V, Pontifex Maximus, abbreviated. From 17th century onwards, the reverse side inscription clearly identifies the subject matter shown in order to simplify diffusion. Here, the bronze mold of Beloved San Carlo Borromeo by Mori in the Vatican collection with the inscription, it's quite clear, Sanctus Carolus Borromeus. I'm now going to summarize some data on Roman Agnus Dei production I partially published a few years ago based on the factory's archives. So, I've been able to establish the production figures for Agnus Dei in kilos from 1572 to the 1960s, so for many centuries. Just look at those few numbers. I can show you these ones that you will be pure easy. And you will see that while quantities of Agnus Dei produced were around a few hundred kilos in the mid-16th century, mass production suddenly took off under Pius V. From 1566 onwards, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of waxes were produced for each blessing. It is easy to imagine them flooding the Roman market, revolutionizing traditional distribution channels, the courier one, family ones, diplomatic one, pilgrim networks as well, and creating the conditions for the establishment of new distribution networks, the missionary ones. I was also able to get a close look at the production of Agnus Dei molds realized by the papal medallists. Actually, it's been 6 years writing the catalogue of the unpublished, undated and unattributed 303 molds in the Vatican collection. And the Apostolic Chamber's accounts list the names of the goldsmiths and the subject matter for the new molds commissioned from them, as well as, on occasion, the subject matter for the renovated molds. I have an example. As the table shows, the goldsmiths made and renovated an exponential number of molds. In 1573, Proto d'Amelia and Federico Cocciola made 13 new subjects and renovated 44 used molds. In 1624, Giacomo Antonio Moro casted 10 new molds and renovated 118 molds. The figure rose to 288 renovated molds in 1677. So, as you can see, this means a considerable variety of possible subjects bearing an iconography that couldn't be more controlled and Roman. Most subjects were treated in several dimensions. 5 dimensions, for example, in 1637. At that date, Gaspare Mola transcribed dimensions of the molds and the waxes in this sketch drawn on a bill for the molds, from grande to piccolissima. Grande was 16 per 12, and piccolissima for rings was 2 per 1 by 1. Differences in size, that is to say, also in iconography, actually reflects a variety of uses to which the waxes were put, to be worn, as I said, as rings, piccolissima, or like the piece at Écouen, you can see it, that it was a medallion that could be worn, or it could also be mounted in small paintings, for example, for private devotion, or yet again set into ostensoria here at Trento, or very often into reliquaries of all sorts, with several pieces here near Como, or in association with Roman relics here as votive gifts in Pellizzano, North Italy. And it was placed on the altar in the churches. So there's I wanted to say that their social uses ranged from, as means the examples I took, from precious diplomatic gift to low-cost objects bountifully handed out by missionaries. As an example, I show 4 different molds of San Francisco Borgia, casted after his canonization by Travani at the beginning. The large piece remains a piece of distinction and was probably mounted in a tableautin or in a monstrance. The small one in mass product must have been distributed during the missions and were rather intended to be worn around the neck. San Francisco Borgia brings me to the role of the Jesuits in this complex story. The Jesuits were not only, along with other missionary orders such as the Franciscan, Dominicans, and the Carmelite monks, to distribute wax. My conviction is that they were one of the driving forces behind a radical transformation in the production of Agnus Dei that took place in the second half of the 16th century. Everything, to me, points in that direction. I won't have time to tell every single part, but I will list some clues. We must first go back to the founders and notice the importance Ignatius and his first companions gave to the Agnus Dei. I checked part of the Monumenta and found dozens of references to Agnus Dei being sent, requested, distributed sparingly in the 1550s, so at a very early moment, even in letters from Ignatius, Peter Faber, and Francis Xavier. I will speak of Ignatius. I found 5 or 6, I don't recall, traces of Ignatius sending Agnus in his letters from the Jubilee of 1550 of Julius III to very selected correspondence, were far from missions, just as all distribution networks would function. On June 1550, he sent some to Father Diego Lainez for Doña Isabel de Vergara de Burgos. In 1556, he sent some blessed by Paul IV to the prior of Carthage, Gerardo Amontano, for possible redistribution. Says, vel retinere, vel dispensare poterit. Ignatius probably wound an Agnus Dei around his neck. This is what a letter from 1553, countersigned by Brigantino, suggests. I quote, la que tengo con el Agnus Dei al cuello en el libro de cartas. I said probably because all editions of the correspondence attribute the passage to Ignatius, but it's not that clear. The importance of the Agnus Dei for Ignatius himself, as well as his pastoral work with the poor, is emphasized first by his contemporaries and then by the canonization process. By his contemporaries first, Peter Faber's in later, I won't have time to develop. But I will take another example that is to say later, dated 6 August 56, describing Ignatius' death by Juan de Polanco, who mentions the presence of the Agnus Dei in Ignatius' few possessions, de los que se iban dispensando. Y algunas with Ave Marias benditas. These arguments fueled his canonization proceedings. In 1605, it is recalled that the Agni, along with the images of the saints and the rosaries, played a key role in his preaching, especially to children and simple folk, to whom he distributed them in person. Here, I insist on that pueros et rudes doceret ilosque minusculis veluti imaginibus sanctorum rosaris et caereis agnis aliceret. The Rotulus also insists on Ignatius' personal devotion to the Agni, rewriting Juan de Polanco's description. He was so devoted to this object that when he died, they were all that was found in his trunk. That's the final part of the quotation. Et tanta fui ipsius legnasi erga supradictas reste votio et affectus, ut post eius mortem in ilius scrigno nihil ferealiut inventum fuerit. And they are talking about grana benedicta et caereus agnus Dei, victesque sanctorum imagines. So, this case sheds some light on the early and constant position of the order in the following centuries. We found many mentions that shows the circulation of Agni from the 1560s onwards in the Monumenta Mexicana, Peruana, Brasiliae, Florida, Antiquae, to stick to America, often corroborated by numerous and very generous gifts of indulgence. I have an example from Peru, 96, from Archivio Storico della Gregoriana. And it's about le, I read, indulgenze concesse da Papa Clemente VIII agli grandi Agnus Dei, reliquie, immagini, quadri, croci, medaglie benedette, a distanza degli padri della Compagnia di Gesù del Perù a 30 agosto del 96, scusate, quali sono le stesse delle Filippine. I underline some passages important to me, quite common, but important. We obviously find a highly militant discourse associated with the conversion of Indians. That's here. Devotamente pregherà, cioè sono concesse l'indulgenza a chi devotamente pregherà il Signore per la pace, per l'esaltazione della Santa Sede Apostolica e per la conversione degli indiani, guadagnerà indulgenza plenaria, eccetera. The second point is that indulgence can be worth the Roman pilgrimage of the 7 churches recently broadcast in Rome by Filippo Neri, as Paul, who is maybe here also noticed in his article I will talk about. Indulgences, sì, it's here, so tutte le altre volte guadagnerà tutte le indulgenze che si guadagnano per i vivi e per i morti visitando tutte le chiese dentro e fuori Roma. And last but not least, and that's very curious, sympathetic. I like this passage. That's the ultimate point. Indulgences provide a right to error, but a limited one. So waxes are very fragile, and these objects are very fragile. So you may break one, but not two. That's the end of the text. Concede sua santità che le suddette indulgenze valgano per tutto il mondo, che perdendosi o rompendosi una delle suddette cose si possa per una volta sola metterne un'altra in luogo di quella. Alors, these beginnings, I said, led to a very lasting Jesuit support for the Agnus Dei. First, on a theoretical level in Rome, in the Pope's direct entourage, I'll briefly take two important examples. The only known iconographic program for the Agnus Dei has been written by a Jesuit. It is kept in the Gregoriana archives, apparently close to the Pope. The Jesuit theologian drew up a long and extremely ambitious 7 pages program for new Agnus Dei molds at direct request of the Pope, according to him. Essendo piaciuto a nostro Signore comendarmi che avessi qualche pensiero sopra alcuna nuova storia da imprimere negli Agnus Dei, deliberai fra me stesso, eccetera. In terms of the positioning of the object in relation to the Roman Church, the program states things very clearly. Questa casa è la Santa Chiesa Cattolica Romana, la quale è una sola, e chi non è dentro di lì non può mangiare con frutto l'agnello immacolato, e la passione di Cristo non è salutifera né efficace per lui. Tali sono gli eretici e gli infedeli profani, dei quali parla San Hieronimo in una epistola a San Damaso, in questo proposito dell'agnello. Onde neanche questi Agnus Dei si devono distribuire se non a fedeli et devoti cristiani. This interest in the Agnus Dei also led to the writing of treatises in the centuries. Here is one by the Jesuit Baldassari, Penitenziere della Sacrosanta Basilica di San Pietro, for the Jubilee of 1700. I now move on to the practical aspects of the dissemination of the Agnus Dei by the Jesuits. The religious and political significance of the sacramentals, and therefore their use and ease of circulation, varied depending on whether we were in Europe, in the lands of Catholicism loyal to the Pope, such as Italy and Spain, in the Europe of religious conflicts, such as France, England, Germany, Hungary, etc., or in the rest of the Catholic world. In lands of undisputed Catholicity, Agnus Dei circulated abundantly and without difficulty. They still circulate through old family and diplomatic networks as lavish diplomatic presents. We saw Ignatius and there are some fine pieces to Burgos. Here is Posivino along with the ambassador to Moscow in 1581. So, l'ambasciatore del Moscovito se ne va soddisfatissimo dell'incontro del Papa con padre Posivino, per il quale sua santità manda al Moscovito un crocifisso di lapis lazzaro di gran prezzo con un Agnus Dei legato et una pietra d'avorio di mano di Michelangelo, bellissima cosa, con altri Agnus Dei all'ambasciatore e agli suoi. So, traditional discourse, situation, diplomatic gifts. In Catholic Europe, Agnus Dei currently accompany the pastoral work of preachers, especially Jesuits, as part of the interior missions. Do we say interior missions? Mission intérieure, particularly on the fringes and the countryside. Such missions were particularly numerous in Italy. In the early 17th century, Jesuit missionaries would almost systematically distribute Agnus Dei along with wreaths, images, medals, and printed booklets the Agnus Dei having particular importance among them as papal sacramentals. The Agnus Dei thus features in treatises about indulgences, such as that by the Jesuit Father Luca Pinelli, always in association with blessed crowns, images, and medals. I will dwell at greater length on the role of the Jesuits in the dissemination of the Agnus Dei in the lands of European conflict. That is, to me, the crux of the matter. The Agnus Dei was an important marker of Catholicity in the wars of religion, like the Roman relics. To date, the role of the Agnus Dei as a political marker, religious marker, has only been studied by Aislinn Muller, who examines the case of England in a really beautiful paper you can see on the screen. The title doesn't mention the Jesuits, but the article is all about Jesuits and shows, in particular, the circulation of Agnus, then banned in England, under the clock, transported by Jesuit missionaries, formed the first Jesuit mission in England in 1574. I am showing here the Agnus Dei of the Transfiguration, probably brought to England by Saint Edmund Campion when he left Rome in 1573 for the first mission in England, before being executed in London in 1581. That is at Oxford Campional Collection. We're not fully, it's not, we're not, it may not be Campion's Agnus Dei, but it's a guess. Yeah, it's probable. Aislinn Muller also explores the role of sacramentals, which she shows, in the absence of access to the sacraments, may have taken their place. I think it's a brilliant idea. I have also plotted this forum, attempting a synthesis here on a European scale with a particular focus on France. In very brief, it shows: 1. That the Jesuits' pioneering role in the mass distribution of the Agnus Dei as an explicit marker of allegiance to Rome dates from the 1570. These waxes were openly worn by supporters of the Pope, especially the Ligueurs. Just have the look at the prose of a French canon at Reims, very close to the Ligueurs and to the Jesuits. He says in a treatise on Agnus Dei of 87, les catholiques recevant et only quotation in French. Les catholiques recevant et portant les Agnus Dei avec tout honneur, les hérétiques les ayant en horreur et abomination, et persécutant ceux qui les portent comme superstitieux et idolâtres, ainsi que nous pouvons voir par les beaux édits d'Angleterre publiés de notre temps. He refers to the fact that Agnus Dei were banned from England, as I already told. In the Catholic waxes, second point, in the Catholic writings, the waxes are directly associated with the construction of missionary martyrs, while in the Protestant anti-Jesuit prose, we find many topoi, including the fact that the Jesuits involved in conspiracy, obviously, were said to have armed French and English tyrannicides or would-be tyrannicides with Agnus Dei. I have two examples. In 1583, John Somerville wore an Agnus Dei when planning to assassinate Queen Elizabeth I, who has banned the Agnus Dei from England. In 1594, Jean Chastel, a Jesuit student, attempted to kill Henry IV. He was said to have been wearing an Agnus Dei under his clothes. I now come to what interests you most, I can imagine, the distribution of the Agnus Dei by the missionary networks, but which I absolutely wanted to put into context to make clear the symbolic importance of the massive shipments of Agnus Dei to Latin America, both to European immigrants and to new converts. The informations I will now give come from several of my old, albeit unpublished, texts on the extra-European distribution of the Agnus Dei, which were themselves largely based on references found in publications on the Jesuit missions. I also mentioned an excellent paper by Paul Nels, published a few months ago, which deals directly with this question, as you can see from the title, which is sent to me on Sunday, and whose very interesting conclusion I fully endorse. As early as the 1560s, when production began to increase, production of waxes, Roman waxes began to increase, Jesuit missionaries began distributing Agnus Dei in Brazil, Mexico, Peru, Philippines, and Japan along with Veronica. We also find Agnus Dei in the rest of the world, where missionaries would go, such as in the Jesuit province of Paraguay and in the Near East in the 1630s. The numbers of Agnus Dei mentioned and sent by the general in Rome follow an exponential curve. Let's take the example of Peru. Let us describe the arrival of 6,000 of Agnus Dei guarnecidos o blancos in 1570. In 1573, of docenas de guarniciones de Agnus Dei, de las muy grandes y ciento de todas suertes para hacer devotos, etc. And we also see that in Mexico, no, oops, where is it? It isn't here. In Mexico, in 1584, Father Francisco Valles complained to Aquaviva that he had very few waxes. Aquaviva had sent him only 600 waxes, a misery, he seems to think. After its creation, the Agnus would also be sent to missions by the Propaganda Fide. Among the agents of circulation, the procurators play a leading role with the Roman authorities, as shown by this extract from the Procurator of India, who considers that asking the general for Agnus and other Roman images is part of his duties. Here, a letter from Mexico. I quote an extract. Pedirlos a vuestra padre, especialmente estando el procurador y procuradores de las provincias con quien se me puede hacer la caridad y limosna. No. Lo dicho es por mi parte y por parte del oficio de procurador. Represento a vuestro padre, vuestra, don't know, las provincias de las Indias, pues la abundancia de Agnus Dei nuevamente hechos da atrevimiento para ello. So, in that correspondence, the missionaries also made their expectations clear. In Peru, for instance, it was first and foremost a question of seducing the local Europeans with Agnus Dei in order, I guess, to better establish the company rather than converting the natives. This aspect seems highly important. You can see here in 1678. No. I missed the quotation. There was. There's a quotation is the Jesuit father saying that he has to deliver waxes to the European people, and that it's very important to settle in the place. So in their correspondence, the missionaries also made that expectations clear, I said. And this aspect, giving the waxes to local Europeans, seems to me highly important, especially from a traditional art historical point of view, because these waxes have probably been the most beautiful and richly mounted pieces. The importance of the gift of Agnus in conversion practices was fundamental. In Rome, in the 17th and 18th century, Muslims and Jewish converts had to buy an Agnus Dei, not the Agnus Dei, its jewelry setting, in order to be baptized. For the missionaries, the first step was to get local population to accept the Agnus Dei and convince them to wear them as pendants. This concern can be seen in the text of post-Tridentine theologians. The Dominican, Vincenzo Bonardo, explained that the Agnus Dei has replaced pagan amulets around the necks of new Christians. In so doing, he obviously described the practices of contemporary missionaries who could substitute waxes for objects associated with non-Christian cults, as they did with Muslim women in the Levant in the 16th century. So they gave them Agnus Dei and took from them all the objects. The missionaries often noticed natives would be enthusiastic with Agnus. Also in Peru in 1578, the Indians welcomed the Agnus, relics, and other Roman objects and beautifully adorned them. Señaladamente se ve en estos indios gran reverencia y devoción al Papa y a las cosas de la Iglesia, que es cosa que han mucho notado los padres. Con Agnus Dei y cuentas benedictas 63 y reliquias tienen grandísima devoción y hanse visto algunas obras maravillosas por la reliquia del Santo Lignum Christus, Crucis, especialmente en partes peligrosas. Especialmente in partes peligrosas. At that time, the Agnus Dei were also worn in Europe as protective amulets by soldiers during the War of Religion. I've said little or nothing about acculturation practices, which I haven't yet worked on and which I'm not the best placed to explore in your presence and also alone. It is actually a fascinating question. I refer you to the article by Paul Ness, and I will add 2 examples from far away in space and time. The first one, also quoted by Paul Ness, is in Goa. In 1578, Nicola Spinola, Jesuit father, writes to the general Mercuriano. He gives a description of a ceremony of Corpus Domini con follie grandi che si usano in queste parti. Lui dice, il giorno del Corpus Domini fecero una processione molto solenne per la nave con follie grandi che si usano in queste parti, levando una casa lavorata molto bella con Agnus Dei molto grande dentro, con 2 figlioli molto ben vestiti, eccetera, eccetera. Poi, second example, this one I love. To open a reflection on the appropriation of Agnus Dei, even in their ornamentation and their containers. This one, I couldn't locate it precisely, but it is from Paraguay, is and was painted in the 20th century by whom? Could be a joker, could be a Catholic who understood nothing about the object. The Agnus Dei, whose purity means whiteness, and whose whiteness means purity, in line with all Easter ceremonies, features a black fleece. He is no longer lying on the book with the 7 seals, but on a green meadow against the summer sky. I come to second part and last part because I won't have time to introduce the third one. Jesuits and iconography. In Rome, the Jesuit order clearly influenced the iconography of the Agnus Dei in line with their ideas and the devotions they supported. I'm going to dwell on this as the art historian I am, but above all because the Agnus Dei have been studied as objects and not really as images, and they are definitely images, although the archives won't say the subject represented on the Agnus. So the Agnus Dei bear witness to the crucial and already quite well-known role played by the Jesuits in the long history of copies of miraculous images, particularly Mayan ones from Loreto to Mexico City. From this point of view, I must recall the importance of the medium. The Agnus is not a simple copy, as would be an engraving, even faithful, but an efficient copy activated by the pontifical blessing. There is every reason to believe that the Jesuits encouraged Pius V to order several Agnus Dei molds for the miraculous statue of Loreto as early as 1572, including this small mold. The work presents the image of the wooden statue of Our Lady of Loreto by St. Luke, and studied the place. Loreto was the focus of growing devotion in modern times, studied by Berset, and in Italy, in particular, the statue was replicated countless times in painting and sculpture from at least the 17th century onwards. By the end of the 16th century, there were many printed, still many printed reproductions of it. Here you can see one of this copy with quoting a part of, in his legend, Consolatrix ac lacrimarum valle, quoting the litanies of Loreto added at the end of the Rosary by Pius V after Lepanto. The mold was then newly used in 1586, 1591, 1592, and so on. So it was very, very popular subjects. Many other, you can see a wax from this mold. Many, so I said it was a popular subject. Many other molds in the image of the statue were commissioned in the 17th century, including significantly 4 molds under Urban VIII between 1630 and 1637. That is to say, just before and in connection with the installation of the first Roman replica of the miraculous statue placed near the Roman church of San Salvatore in Lauro in 1638. I'd be interested to know if you found any Agnus of the Madonna of Loreto in Mexico, Elena. This example was for you. The Jesuits then continued to support the distribution of reproductions of Mayan images throughout the modern era, from the time of the Roman approval of their cult, often in conjunction with the circulation in Rome of large-scale copies. I'll take 2 examples from Mexico. Due to local Jesuit agents, which cross the history, obviously, of the Gumpemberg Atlas and its local variations, in particular the Zodiaco Mariano of the Jesuit father de Florencia, written at the end of the 16th century and later published in Mexico. First of all, Our Lady of Guadalupe. These 2 small mounds you can see on the screen date from the second half of the 18th century, and precisely from 54 I now established. When the cult of the Aqueropoiat Mexican Virgin, which had become established in New Spain in the 16th century and in Spain in the following century, was recognized in Rome by Benedict XIV. He declared her patroness of the Kingdom of New Spain in 1654, as desired by the Spanish crown of the Jesuit missionaries, and achieved, the thing was achieved by Juan Francis Lopez, who was elected procurator of the Mexican province to Rome and Madrid in 1751. Juan Francis Lopez had previously brought a copy of the miraculous image. The first one arrived in Rome in 52, a copy by Miguel Cabrera, which is still in Rome, nella chiesa del Monastero della Visitazione. We know that other copies arrived a few years later, among them one in the Collegio Romano. The waxes were clearly intended to Spain and New Spain, probably at Lopez's request. Here a wax from 54. And he might also have asked for the vernacular Spanish inscription, Beata, abbreviated one, but Beata Virgen de Guadalupe Mexicana, which is extremely rare, the first one I know. The inscription always in Latin. I love final example of strong Jesuit lobbying in Rome linked to the missions, although I couldn't find who was the agent in this case. This mood represents a miraculous statue of Our Lady of Guanajuato near Mexico. She is co-patroness with St. Ignatius and St. Nicholas of Tolentino of the city, located northwest of Mexico City. Francisco de Florencia, I already signaled, mentions it in his Mayan Zodiaco among the 9 miraculous Mayan images of the Diocese of Michoacan, whose cult was supported actually by the Jesuits. According to tradition and to de Florencia, Philip II sent the statue, rediscovered in Granada after the Reconquista, to Guanajuato. The mold was obviously made at the request of the Society of Jesus, I guess to celebrate the consecration of the Baroque church Nuestra Señora de Guanajuato, built between 1671 and 1696, and intended then to highly targeted circulations. So the wax was to be sent to Mexico, directly to Mexico, and not elsewhere. Last point about iconography. Jesuit supports the changes in iconography of Agnus Dei because, no, I go back. Given its origins and his link with the Easter festivities, the Agnus favored a sacrificial iconography in the 16th century, which was later recuperated in a discourse in defense of the Eucharistic cult. The Agnus soon show a systematic association between the Eucharistic cult and Petrine legitimacy. For the record, I show the Transfiguration we have already seen, which recovers Raphael's Transfiguration. That was here the upper part, that was San Pietro in Montorio, but modify it. Peter, I can show you the 2 Peters. And so the modification, the significant modifications the goldsmith made, we can see that in Raphael's model, Peter was couldn't look at the apparition. He was terrorized, and he was dried. Men, but on the mold, you can see Peter in the upright position of the Good Shepherd. His eyes turned towards the apparition he is looking at, straight as Atlas. So it's a modification, very significant, highly significant modification. This was particularly noticeable in the context of the wars of religion, in the propaganda of the French leaguers, and in the program I already mentioned of the Jesuit theologian in 1591. In this program, the Jesuit theologians decided to introduce subjects with the Pope, with the representation of the Pope, not only the figure of St. Peter as it was before, but the Pope directly, the individual Pope. So he introduced 5 subjects with the Pope. You have the list here, and I will take an example, that is the last one, the coronation of the Pope by the Child, surrounded by Saints Lorenzo, Nicholas of Bari, Blaise, and Gregory the Great. Here you have the text of the theologians, and then the mold, very crowded mold, that Diomedevani did from this program. Si è ancora fatto un Cristo piccolo che in braccio della Madre Santissima con regno pontificale, che tiene in mano corona nostro Signore, al quale d'intorno son molti agnelli. You can find in the legend the motto of the Pope, Dextera Domini exaltavit me, and we can see and identify so the child that is crowning the Pope, but it is a picture, a portrait of the Pope, and it can be confronted with all the pictures of Gregory XIV. It's actually a picture, a portrait. So I can't speak anymore, so I will go on this third part I knew I couldn't do. I wanted just to point that the Agnus Dei were very important in the diffusion of Jesuit sanctity, and that we still have 21 molds of Jesuit saints still in the collections of the Musei Vaticani, out of I think around 60 molds produced in the centuries. And I can show you here the list of the Jesuit saints with the centuries. There were many of them were made in the last century. Here, for example, Saint Bellarmine and the Canadian Martes. And my PowerPoint is too and the last thing I wanted to say is that the Agnus Dei were very important in the construction of global Jesuits canonization imagery. I had an example, but I won't have the time to discuss this. Here, the death of Saint John Francis Regis, and the insistence on the angel that doesn't come from the geography, but from the previous Roman imagery. So I have a very, very brief conclusion. If I can find my conclusion, I can find it. It will be really brief. The fabric of the Agnus Dei was interrupted in 1969 after Vatican II. It's very highly significant that it would be an Argentine Jesuit that would have waxes made for the Giubileo della Misericordia nel 216. Although he had them made in by the monks, but by likes, with new molds. I'm happy with that, and in few exemplaries, quantities that would record medieval, high medieval ones. Okay. Finish with these images.
Okay. So, well, thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. I'm sure there will be many questions and doubts that or reactions. Well, let's wait for some reactions. As I said, I have some questions also, but I don't know if Corina. Okay, go ahead.
Anne, merci beaucoup. Ça a été formidable et très enrichissant. J'ai bien aimé. And I have some questions. The first one, I'm not sure if I understood well. And in the first part, you showed us a slide with 8 points, like 8 rules. And the number 8, if I understood well, was if the Agnus Dei is broken, you have to change it. You have to replace it.
So, risponderò in italiano o in francese.
Oh, in English, please. My Italian is horrible.
In French?
Yes, but I don't know for the group.
Well, yes, it was a brief for indulgences, and the thing was that I told that the waxes were very fragile, and that would frequently be rotten. I actually have rotten several, so it's very easy to break them, and you had to put them in continents that would protect them, but actually for the missions they would travel in cases, huge cases, and they wouldn't be placed in these continents. Yeah. So the missionaries could give you a second Agnus is you broke the first one, but if you broke the second one is I mean, I think that you are negligent, so you won't have the right to have a third one. I understood that like that. There may be another interpretation that maybe Paul, if he's here, would develop, because we can see traffic of fragments of waxes in everywhere and in the missions, and I think that the missionaries didn't want to encourage, to encourager these practices, or they're ambiguous. Rome wouldn't approve of this.
Okay. I am asking because Montoya mentions in 1639 that a neophyte, after joining a congregation, always carried with him several holy cards and a little piece of Agnus Dei and a bit of holy wax devoutly in a leather pouch hang around the neck. And I asked myself, this little piece of Agnus Dei, Does it mean it was just a tiny one, a piccolini, or is it just a piece because they did not have so much pieces of whole Agnus Dei, and so they cut it like relics? They could cut them, and the little piece was enforced by the power, so no problem. And that's the question I have with the Agnus Dei. Do you have other examples of broken Agnus Dei that could work like Agnus Dei, like a relic? They use it like relic.
Yes, I have many. There are many in the archive of the Roman Inquisition, because it's highly prohibited. But we know that it was done the same, and I think Paul would have examples, because I saw he spoke of that in his paper. As for the text, your example, I should see the text, because I should guess from the text if he's speaking about little Agnus Dei that were commonly worn around the neck, or about a fragment of Agnus Dei.
Might be to the whole group, as I'm not Spanish, so might be I don't interpret it well. The original text says, guardólos en una bolsita donde traía un pedacico de Agnus aforrado. Y eso de pedacico, is it ambiguous, or is it just a little one?
No, I'm not Spanish.
Yeah, no, it's pretty clear from Spanish that it's a piece of it.
So it's a little piece, not a
Piece.
or a cut piece. ¿Es cortado o es el entero?
It is a little piece. It seems to be a fragment.
A fragment. And if ever it's a fragment, you have to see a little piece of the image of the stamp in it to recognize that it is a Agnus Dei. I think so.
Do I have? Oh,
I ask myself, how is this piece? There must be a little bit of the image on. No?
I think that there were both images and objects, that they could be used as images, and I would prone for studies in that direction. But there are also objects that function as relics, and a piece is in line with the whole. But obviously, if you have a little piece, you can't see the image, and I don't think you can know what the image was. The important thing is that it's a piece of Agnus Dei, of a sacred lamb blessed in Rome.
Okay, thank you very much. And just a little third question, also a language question. Un Agnus Dei compuesto, an Agnus Dei composé. What does this mean? It's with guarnition, it is with silver, or is there anything composé, compuesto, something to materiality? Could it be linked to? That's just an impression from a document of the ship papers. So there's no explanation, no context, and I ask myself, what could that be? Agnus Dei compuesto.
I'm not very used to Spanish archives, so I could answer for Italian ones. Very often in Italian archives or inventories of Judas, they specify if the wax is nude, or if it's set in a continent.
In silver or in silk, things like this. Yeah.
Wax in a crystal.
Okay. Well, okay. Thank you very much, Anne, for these answers. Thank you.
Okay. I think Paul asked to speak. Paul, the floor is yours.
Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning from where I'm speaking. And thanks for a brilliant paper. It's nice to meet in this way as well. I've learned so much from for your work, and for those who maybe aren't as familiar with Agnus Dei as Anne and myself, her work is really fundamental. It's really some of the first truly original work on Agnus Dei in many decades. So I'm very grateful for that. I'll just speak to this question of fragments and so on first. Maybe because it's from the missionary sources I've looked at, it's clear that fragments are in constant circulation, and we have examples of Agnus Dei being broken into thousands of fragments, and so it's impossible that the iconography, even elements of the iconography, would maintain intact. And so it, therefore the person delivering the Agnus Dei and the the stories that circle around the Agnus Dei, the sort of handing over, become very much part of that circulation, because otherwise it's just a piece of wax, right? But very much in the similar manner as relics, in the same way you need. But I don't know, and maybe Anne does. I don't know of any labels or etiquette for Agnus Dei, but you do find them, interestingly, particularly in Mexican examples of Agnus Dei, sort of composed, as we would say, frames and so on. They're often arranged together with fragments, together with the labels, the fragment labels itself. But that's sort of a whole nother side of things. As for that, I mean, and you've really complicated our understanding of the Jesuits and Agnus Dei. There's no smoking gun. Obviously, where the Jesuits are the sort of, Deus ex machina of Agnus Dei manufacture, but they're definitely present there. But there's also a tension, right, between what Rome wants and what the official line on Agnus Dei, and as a sort of vehicle of popular papal ideology, and then what people end up doing with Agnus Dei in reality. And I was just wondering if you can, and we see that in terms of sacramentals, because the theology of sacramentals for holy water, for example, is meant to be dispersed, and you can, in Jesuits even at some point receive license to dilute holy water to spread it further. But then at the same time, there's this attempt to control, and no, they have to be uncolored, and they have to be do you see other examples? Are there other examples of this tension between the sort of Roman ideology and then the sort of grappling with what is happening in the popular fields?
Yes, the fragment and the coloration. The coloration is a big problem because it's forbidden by Gregory XIII, highly forbidden, and he says we cannot, because the purity of the Agnus, the fact it is white, is very, very important. It's consonant to the significance of the piece. But this device, this prohibition of painting the waxes, was suspected in Italy. It's because it was they would have serious problems if they wouldn't. But it was not, and elsewhere, and I found a certain number of waxes, of painted waxes, in Spain and in Latin America. Not so many, I would say, but a certain number. And it can be easily understood, because if you have a painted one, you can see the iconography and read the inscription very well, which can be difficult with the white one, for example. So there is, for example, this aspect. And for the iconography, it's clearly a Roman factory, apostolic factory, and the Jesuit influence depends on the Jesuit position with the reigning Pope. clearly. So it was important under Gregory XIV, and then there are many problems. The obvious thing is that the order was very good at obtaining new mods. I quite devoted myself because I saw how every order tried to have molds of his saints, and the Jesuits are very, very brave at it, I must say.
Thank you. Coco has the floor.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Anne, very much, and also welcome and thank you, Paul, as well for being with us and sharing your knowledge on this topic. And in fact, I have several questions, and I would just encourage you both to jump in. On this issue of tension that you were mentioning, Paul, I work more on the later period, and there's a famous quote by Father Oviedo in the 18th century when he comes as a procurator to Rome, and he eventually meets the Pope, and supposedly the Pope says to him, "Why do you want so many Agnus Dei over there in Mexico?" Oviedo goes on into the different uses and the portability and the way people use them, and it's kind of a passage that I think you can interpret a bit ambiguously. In other words, that Oviedo himself sometimes seems to be criticizing a kind of use that has to do, and this is a later period, the 18th century, with fashion almost, and what's fashionable even in terms of wearing and kind of jewelry or how people look. So I was wondering if either one of you could speak to this issue also of prestige for the viceroyalties and certain parts in the viceroyalties. But I wouldn't even, one thing we often insist on for those of us that work in the viceroyalty is that you should not always separate the indigenous or the evangelization context from a kind of social context or an elite context, that those can coexist and mix in many ways. But one sense we have in general in this group and the project that we're working on about the objects that are sent, especially from Rome, is that also just the fact that they are Roman things, that they come from the Pope, they come from the Vatican, that they have a value and a prestige because that's so far away, in addition to the religious valence and the power of those sacramentals. So I'm just wondering if you share that sense, or if you think it is something that changes a lot chronologically over time, or if there's anything you would add to that.
Yes, of course. The Agnus Dei used to be diplomatic gifts, only diplomatic gifts during the Middle Ages and until the 15th, 16th, beginning of the 16th century. But there still are very prestigious diplomatic gifts, and we saw it clearly in the archives, Roman archives. I can have a few examples that the Pope would send cases, entire boxes of Agnus Dei, and he would have his goldsmiths a continent, beautiful, precious continent to send to various dignitaries. So the two things I would say that make the character, the preciousness of the Agnus, the three things, is the dimensions. Still the dimensions, the big pieces, they're very big and peasant. So it's a huge quantity of wax, and there are few. And they're distributed. We know for Rome, I know exactly how it occurs. And there are few pieces distributed only to important people and designated to crowns, etc. The second type of Agnus Dei that would be very prestigious is when there are both Agnus Dei and relics. That occurs with Pius V, because one of his miracles is linked with an Agnus Dei. And that occurs the second time with Innocent 11, because there would be a miracle linked to Agnus Dei. So the thing I saw is after Pius V would be beatified and canonized, all the crown heads would search to have an Agnus Dei blessed by him, because it was also a relic. So that's the second reason. And the third one was was the continent. All the preciousness, the price of the Agnus Dei, the material price, is in the continent. So you can have a very humble thing with a hole and cordon, come dirla, una cordoncino, very humble one, or you can have everything, and then it is there are pieces of February, of very, very prestigious as you want them to be. As for the relics,
okay.
Can I come in on this?
Sure.
Sorry.
Sure, go ahead. Yep.
Yeah, sure. So, thanks, Ellen. And just to go back to the colonial context as well, I would suggest also we have to see these localized as well, and whether that's the Philippines or Peru or New Spain. My sense is that there is a particular settler colonial demand in Mexico for Agnus Dei that I don't have the same, the sources are difficult and for themselves fragmentary and so on. But the comparative example would be Peru, where I don't think they're as popular. And the interesting counter example there would be the Philippines, because of the close links between the Philippines and New Spain, and to see what happens with the cult there. But that would be another line of investigation. But there is, it's been a few years since I've looked at this, but there is that correspondence between Kierkegaard, right, and this Jesuit I don't even know if he's Jesuit anymore, in Puebla. Right, and so Kierkegaard is sending Agnus Dei to Puebla, and you have the Chavo chapel there in Puebla. It's built in the late 17th century as well. That is dozens of Agnus Dei, but one of the and I might be off on the periodization, but one of the Puebla Jesuits is saying, we can't get these Agnus Dei out to the missions because the colonial demand is so high, and so there is definitely a tension there. But and also this changes over time, right? I mean, late 17th century New Spain is very different than late 16th century in terms of, and this is something your group would know more about in terms of the demand for art than the familiarity with European forms and so on. But it is worth problematizing. I agree.
Thank you very much to both of you. Yeah, I have other questions, but I know that other people are ready to ask questions, so I'll come back later if not. But thank you.
Okay, Josefina, go ahead, please.
Gracias, Alexandre. Et bonjour, Anne. C'est un plaisir de te revoir. Bon, je demande en anglais. I was very interested in what you said and the quotes that you comment regarding the place of the Agnus Dei in the missions and among indigenous population in colonial America. And in relation to what Paul was telling us too, for Mexican appearance of this kind of objects, I would like to say that in the case of the southern border of the royalty of Peru in Chile, many Agnus Dei are founded in Spanish and Creole wills, as little objects used as medals. They are also found in archives related to churches and linked to other kind of objects, for example, to monstrance or crosses, but they are not found, that's what I have seen, in mission spaces. I don't know if in Mexico, you, Paul, had found this kind of objects in mission spaces, or maybe you, Alexander, in Philippines. And I don't know if you know if these objects were important also for missions spaces in Europe. And I would like to say maybe after the Protestant crisis.
Who first? So for answers on 2 points, maybe first on the churches and the various contexts. So I must say I know little or nothing of the colonial context. That's not my specialty. But for Europe, I noticed that the uses, the functions of the Agnus Dei, which has been described as devotional pieces, private devotional pieces, are many and larger, infinitely larger. So I found them as medal of foundations in medieval churches. I found them, as I briefly shared, in monstrance. And the comparison with the hostia, and with the relic is everywhere in the Tridentine texts. So Agnus would be compared with relics, and we often find him in relics, and even in the Editi, Agnus Dei and relics do have the same treatments. So we have this solidarity, I would say, between the two objects, and they are quite often exposed at the same way, and Agnus Dei would be exposed as relics, very fun, very often. They would also be exposed as hostias in ostensory. And if you have a look at the l'orfèvrerie, the material, we can see that in Italian churches, the waxes, big waxes, in that case, would be placed very often, as I said, on altars, in Eucharistic monstrances, both round and oval, and we know that the hostia could be oval in modern times, and that's the same object. Or it could be exposed in reliquaries, various typologies of reliquaries, alone or with relics. So there is tensions around the stages of what is the Agnus Dei. In the text, it is the theologian says it is consecrated, and it is the comparison with the hostia is very developed in the text of the Tridentine period. So I wanted to say that the functions of the Agnus are many, and that stages of the Agnus is not so clear. I found young Jesuits that would celebrate the Mass with an Agnus Dei. You can find those things frequently. And I forgot the second thing I wanted to say. What was the late question?
I was thinking about the if Agnus Dei were used in this Protestant crisis. When I remember, for example, for the relics, that you could find a lot of relics among the frontiers of Protestant territories in Europe. Are the Agnus Dei functioning in the same way as relics, I don't know.
I think there is mapping that's very difficult to map their circulations, as I already told. But I found concentrations, very high concentrations of relics, but of Agnus Dei in North Italy, for example, in Trento. There are so many. And what I saw that the missionaries would go on distributing Agnus Dei even after the wars of religion I talked about. It's obvious that the practice will go on, and we can see the circulation of Agnus Dei in Europe, in Europe as well. There are many of them everywhere, and in particular in the frontiers of Catholicity. From the beginning, the Pope sent them in England to Mary Stuart. He sent them in the territories of conflict, religious conflicts, and systematic. It was quite systematic. So this is very important for the end of the 15th century, 16th century, but it goes on later on.
Merci.
Okay. To add something about what Josefina was saying, I didn't find particularly in the Philippines something related to Agnus Dei, but certainly as Anne mentioned, he was showing this paragraph in 1578 Peru, when she says that there were Agnus Dei en partes peligrosas. Of course, I was thinking of the Philippines and the Marianas, because there were no more dangerous places than those in Asia Pacific territories. But quite frankly, I didn't find Jesuits bringing these objects with them. But of course, I was wondering if what you Anne said, that probably these Agnus Dei could be also very interesting objects to bring with them, with the Jesuits that went, for instance, to the Japanese places in these objects that were important for ambassadors, because we know that the Jesuits were very crucial ambassadors in Japan. So I was wondering if, even though we know that, as you said, you're not interested in colonial territories, but since we in this group are very interested in that, should be great to have a research on these territories and see if these Jesuits were bringing Agnus Dei with them, and which kind of function these objects had, because I see these objects much more useful for those ambassadors going, for instance, to the courts of Mughal in India or Japan or even to Macau than, for instance, to the mission. But that's an hypothesis. I don't know. When I was doing research, I never pay attention to that, quite frankly. But I would say that these objects probably were much more important, as I said, for these ambassadors than for the missionaries who went to the outskirts mission.
I frequently saw them from Roman archives. That's my main point of view, because the Pope would have brilliant, beautiful cases done in order to give to the ambassador enormous quantities of waxes. And there is this idea lying that the one who would be destinatory of the Agnus Dei would then also distribute waxes. There's I don't know if I'm clear. It's like a chain. The Pope would give great quantities of Agnus Dei. He will send him to the ambassador, to a king that would distribute them as well. And it was the same with the courier. The Pope would give the cardinal to many waxes, and the cardinal would distribute them, and so on. When there are so many, because like that as well.
Okay, thanks a lot. Any other questions?
another question if we have
Okay.
time.
I was about to jump, but go ahead.
Okay. Can you talk a little bit about forgeries? In other words, so we know there's this problem, right? That Agnus Days were forged. Do these still exist? You know, the way we say in every museum, there's a couple of forgeries hanging on the walls. Are there forgeries of Agnus Dei around us that we are not identifying, or were they destroyed, or do we know anything about who produced them? Was it Roman competition? Was it done elsewhere?
Yes, it's quite clear. There were many of them, and we found laws and ancient laws from the 14th, 15th century prohibiting the force and with condemnations. It's obvious that it was a Roman market and great markets when the Agnus were not numerous. So when they become so many, it's little the competition to have them is not so high. But the obvious thing is that the Pope would have the goldsmiths work in the Vatican Palace, and then the monks work in the Vatican Palace in order not to let the molds, in order the molds couldn't be used to do forgery with the original molds or with copy of the molds. So everything took place in the Vatican Apostolic Palace, so to avoid forgeries, I think. The interesting is that in the 16th, 17th century, the goldsmiths family Amerani of the Pope would copy the molds, but to do devotional medals. They have them, they have access to them, and they would take them and make a huge production of devotional medals out of the molds. But their models are not Agnus Dei. Those are not false. I recently encountered a fake from a monastery, Italian monastery, that would say they recently had done the Agnus Dei, and it was obvious that they were fake to me. And they presented them as if it was a tradition, and absolutely it's not. But you can scarcely find Agnus Dei in museum. So fakes, I don't think so.
Okay, thank you. Josefina requested the floor.
Thank you, Anne. Encore moi. I would like to ask you, because for this example of Agnus Dei that you show us, that it came from le Musée de la Renaissance. Because I think, is that metal and wax, or is just painted wax?
It is painted, miniatured wax, and then you have metal on the continent with crystal.
I mean, each side, the Imago Pietatis and the lamp. Okay.
The prohibition.
Okay. Because I thought it was metal. Okay, it's just painted wax before the prohibition.
Precious pigments. It was very, very expensive too. And the aquarium was beautiful. It's been painted in Rome.
The quality of the objects made me think it was metal, painted metal. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Any other question? I have another one. Just a quick one. And when you were showing us this table in which you were putting the kilos of the Agnus Dei, I was curious about one number you were putting there. In 1636, Urban VIII was making 4,600 659 kilos, and this was considerably less than what Clement VIII was making, was about 10,000 kilos. I'm sure that has to do with all these prohibitions about the canonization, beatification processes that Urban VIII was putting. So I was wondering how sure that this was affecting the making of this Agnus Dei, but what about trafficking? Was trafficking about these objects? Because even though we know that there were less Agnus Dei, that doesn't mean that, for instance, I'm thinking about overseas territories, they were demanding this object. Can we say that there were demands, even though popes were not interested in producing more objects like this? So what do you think?
I'm not sure I understood all the question, but the demand was always very high. The production would vary for several reasons, I would say. Usually, for the first year of the pontificate, you would have a huge production if you have the time to do it, because the production of Agnus Dei, the manufacturers of Agnus Dei, would demand months of labor. It's very, very long to do that. So you have to have the time. You have to have the time to have the goldsmiths do the new molds and renovated the old ones. And you have to let a few months to the friars to do the waxes, the million of waxes. Then you have variations that can be significant, but the production remains very, very high until the beginning of the 18th century. During the 18th century, it's quite high, but it would drop, and during the 19th century, it's very, very low. So I don't know if I answered you, but I think that demand is always important. We don't have many examples with Agnus Dei that remains, that wouldn't be given in Rome. And if that occurs, it's that the Pope is dead, and there hasn't been time.
No, I understand. I understand that, but since there's this connection between Agnus Dei and canonization, because I see that this Pope, this particular Pope, but we all know that was not interested in promoting saints, and as we know, he was restricting canonization, particularly the Spanish one. So I see that this, when you were mentioning the numbers, that in 1636 we can see less kilos, and I was wondering, probably this connection is important for this.
I don't think so. Also because his pontificate was a turning point. The Agnus Dei would become a systematic canonization image under Urban VIII. But the first, I think, Agnus of Saint is that for the canonization of San Carlo Borromeo, but it's not usual. And then it will become quite usual. There are no Agnus Dei made for Ignatius in 22. They will come later on, because there are becoming images of canonization, but there is not already done, I would say.
Okay, thank you. Coco?
One last question. Thank you so much. We have lots of questions about these objects, and I'd just like to come back to something that Corina said, which has to do with, again, something that we're working on in the project, which is what are procurator documents referencing? with their particular vocabulary. In fact, Corina directs for the project a dictionary of traveling objects that we're working on. So it might be very helpful for us if one of the ways in which Agnus show up in procurator documents later on in the late 17th century and on is either as rings, as grandes, large, or the most common term is ordinary, ordinarios. So just I'm wondering if within your scale of piccolo piccolini sizes, what is an ordinario to you? Could you enlighten us there? What was the most common size?
Yes. The most common size, I should say, is 4 per 3 or 5 per 4. This piccolo, a non-piccolino, that is 4 rings, especially for rings, and that is not always done. So I think the most common are little ones, a few centimeters, and with a legible image. It's not obvious for the ring. You can have a crucifixions, but less more. And yes, the ordinary one should be those ones. Clearly.
Terrific. I see Corina taking notes, so terrific.
Okay. Any other question we have? No? Anything else? Okay. So if there are no more questions, I don't know, we should maybe thank Anne for this wonderful presentation that you gave us. And what else? Any other comments? Or I have an announcement to make about the next guest speaker we will be having in this season. But I don't know if I should do it now, or maybe we can. Okay, it's Pedro Omar. He said that he cannot be with us on Tuesdays, so maybe we should move our session to Wednesdays, because that's the only day he can make it. So I don't know if you guys can gather Wednesdays or not, but he definitely cannot. That's the thing. I can write you an email later with the options, but he just wrote me an email saying that Tuesdays are impossible for him. Okay, so Anne, thank you very much for your presentation. We enjoy it very much, and we'll see you for the next session. Okay.
Thank you, Alexander. Thank you, Anne.
Thank you.
Yeah.
For being with us.
Bye.
Merci beaucoup.
Bye bye. Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Bye.